Okay, we'll get started. So welcome everyone to this webinar from Cambridge Centre for Evaluation and Monitoring, which is all about using adaptive baseline assessments to improve your school's performance. So just before we get started with the session, a few housekeeping notes. To ensure good sound quality, all members of the audience are muted. But if you would like to ask a question or give a comment, please use the question section located on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll make sure we answer all questions, or as many as we can, at the end of the webinar. But please do ask questions throughout the session if there's anything you'd like us to expand on more, or if you have any thoughts. You will receive a certificate of attendance sent to your email inbox an hour after the webinar finishes, and you'll receive a copy of the webinar recording sent via email next week. So we'd love to hear where you're joining us from today. So please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box. We'd also like to know what techniques you currently use to improve your school's performance, or what you might like to get out of today's session. So please do put any comments in the question section. So I'll now hand over to Suzanne, who will be leading our webinar today. Thanks, Suzanne.
Thank you, Cora. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Suzanne Tipping, and I'm an assessment advisor at the Centre for Evaluation and Monitoring. Part of my role is to provide specialist knowledge about our baseline assessments, our wellbeing check and professional development, and I advise schools on the benefits and uses of all of our assessments from ages 3 to 4, with aspects all the way through to Alice at post 16. And I work closely with schools and colleges to support their ongoing school improvement and future assessment strategies. And I'm a former secondary school teacher myself. I used to teach business, IT and economics, and I've got 20 years experience in the classroom. And during that time, I was also a subject lead of GCSE business, and I've been a deputy head of year, so I've had a pastoral role as well. And just a little bit about Cambridge Chem. So we are the Centre for Evaluation and Monitoring. We're part of the Cambridge family. We're celebrating our 40th birthday this year, and our assessments are now used in over 90 countries globally. And Chem's one of the largest and longest established providers of adaptive, formative and baseline assessments, as I mentioned before, for children of all ages, from early years all the way up to post 16. And Chem's methods are all research-based, evidence-driven and market-tested, and built on foundation of non-commercial academic practice. So I'll tell you a little bit about our Chem baseline assessments today, with focus on how they can help you to improve your school performance. But our assessments are computer adaptive tests, which are relevant to all learners. So they're all completed on computer, they're digital tests, and they're adaptive in their nature. So all of the assessments, when students are answering the questions will adapt based on the responses that the students give. So if they get a question right, they'll be presented with a more difficult question. If they get the question wrong, they'll be presented with a slightly easier one. And the baseline tests measure cognitive abilities and cross-curricular knowledge, skills and understanding. And I'll talk a little bit about which skills and abilities they assess later on. They don't require any preparation or teaching in advance. They're not curriculum specific. And they help students, therefore, understand their learners more holistically. They're not curriculum-based, they're not subject-specific, they're not high-stakes competitive tests or summative in any way, but the data that they present will help to support learners, and it will help you understand what their ability levels are in certain areas. So all of our secondary assessments take around 50 minutes to complete. So schools will deliver the assessment to establish a baseline of a learner's cognitive ability. So it takes around 50 minutes. The assessments are adaptive, as I mentioned before. So the questions that they're presented with will react to whether they get the questions right or wrong. And they're computer-based. So the fact that they're digital means that there's no marking involved, there's no additional workload for teachers or coordinators in school. And then once the assessments have been completed, reports will then be automatically generated, and you'll be able to access detailed reporting, which will be at individual student, group, so class or year group, and also school level. And also, if you're part of a multi-academy trust, you can look at data at a group level as well. And that will allow you to compare data in terms of comparing one student to another, one class to another, one cohort to a previous cohort, or perhaps students in one school to another. And it'll allow you to compare data over time as well, so you can understand what progress has been made by your pupils. And this data that's provided in the reports provides school leaders with forecasts for future attainment. So our mid-year and YELLIS assessments that I'll tell you about today provide predictions for GCSE and IGCSE. And then once you've got that data, that helps you to decide what intervention you might want to implement to try and ensure that all of your students fulfill their potential. So it helps to facilitate monitoring and quality assurances. You'll be able to look at your data, look at your predictions, you'll be able to track progress against those predictions. So it's really useful for your monitoring purposes. And it also helps to validate schools' internal attainment and progress data as well. The data can be used at multiple levels. So it can be used at school and year group level. But in addition to that, as I mentioned before, if you're a multi-academy trust, it can be used across the multi-academy trust at a group level as well. You can use the data at class level, and you can use the data at individual student level too. So I'm going to talk to you about who within the school might use the data at those different levels. So starting with the directors and senior leaders at a multi-academy trust level, you can support MAT evaluation with the data. Because you're using standardised assessments that are all completed by all of the students in all of your schools in the same way, it means that your scores will be more standardised across the schools and you'll have comparative data. It'll help you to identify strengths and weaknesses within for students within different cohorts in different schools. And you can also use it to support allocating resources, because you'll be able to see the ability levels of cohorts in the different schools within your trust. I'm going to talk about value-added data later on, and because we actually calculate value-added for you as well, this can be used to identify where there might be opportunities to share good practice between schools, but also between different departments and different schools as well. So it might be used in a similar way by the senior leadership team at a school level, but more specifically, SLT might use predictive data to review indicators of potential exam performance. So you can forecast what the future exam performance is likely to be for a particular cohort. It helps you to develop evidence-driven intervention strategies. And I'll give you some ideas of different intervention strategies that some of our schools use during this webinar as well. And it can be an indicator of how you might want to allocate resources within school. It might help you to aid HR planning. So if you need additional tutors, additional support assistants, or additional teaching staff in particular areas, for example, it can help you to plan continuous professional development. So, for example, I've been talking to some schools and some of our Chem networks recently who actually said that they deliver CPD specifically about their Chem assessments, and helping teachers to understand the data and also help to understand how they can use that data to support their teaching and learning. And also the data from the assessments can be used to calculate value added as well. On a pastoral level, a head of year might use the data from the Chem assessments, because you'll be able to spot those who are fulfilling their potential and those who currently aren't, with ongoing tracking against the predictions. So you'll be able to spot those who might be coasting, but also those who are really pushing themselves to the limit. So any praise, recognition, or encouragement, care and support can all be applied in the right way to the right student at the right time. Heads of department and subject leads can use the data because it helps them to understand classes within their department or their faculty, what their ability levels are. And based on that, it can support the development of schemes of learning so that the right activities and differentiated tasks are included in the scheme of learning to provide the right level of support and challenge. At a classroom level, teachers can also use the data. So if the data is shared with teachers and they can see student profiles, they can understand what their ability levels are in the different areas. and that can help teachers to form individual expectations in terms of what their ability levels are in the different areas. But also, if they know what their predictions are, then it can help to influence subject level target grades, and it can help to give teachers an expectations of what level students should be working at. But knowing their ability levels in addition to that in the specific areas can also help them to develop differentiated resources which are really bespoke and specific to the students in their class. SENCO, learning support assistants and teaching assistants can use this data as well. Although the baseline assessments that we have are not diagnostic in any way, they can be used to provide preliminary screening for additional learning needs, and you can see where students might struggle and where they might need some additional support. And it also will help them to see exactly what kind of support they can give individual students on a one-to-one basis, but also small groups of students as well, whether that be within the class or outside the class, in small groups or one-to-one as well. We have particular reports, which I'll show you later on, which are quite useful to share with students. So, for example, a lot of schools that I've spoken to recently said that they like to use our chances graphs reports with students so that they can see what probability they have of achieving a particular grade in each of their different subject areas. And this also sometimes is used to support them making subject choices in terms of what they would like to take for their GCSEs, but also beyond GCSEs and looking towards the future in their A levels as well, if our schools complete the ALICE assessment. We do have a parent report, and the parent report explains what our baseline assessments are, why they're carried out, why we assess certain areas, and it gives a parent-friendly explanation of our assessments. And it also gives an overview of what their results were in the different ability areas, and just giving the parents an understanding of why we carry out these assessments and how we use the data helps them to understand that we use it in a way which allows us to support them in all of the ways that we've already mentioned. But again, as I mentioned, during our Chem Networks, a lot of the schools said that they were actually using the chances graphs to form discussion points with parents as well, so that they can, maybe if you're trying to be motivational with students and say, we've got evidence here that a student who scored a certain score in their baseline assessment could go on to achieve a level 9, and we can see what percentage of those students achieved a level 9 in that particular subject area, then they can see that it's possible for their children as well. So moving on just to talk a little bit more about our baseline assessments. I've mentioned already that they are adaptive, and what that means is that the questions that they're presented with respond to the answers that the students give. So as they're going through our assessments, they will be presented with a question. If they get that question right, they'll be presented with a slightly more difficult question. And that will continue until they get a question wrong, and they'll be presented with a slightly easier question. This gives us a really specific idea of the ability level of the student taking the assessment, rather than as all students being presented with all of the same questions, and potentially they could get all of those questions right. We have a large bank of questions, which really does help us to pinpoint their exact ability levels. And once we have the data from these assessments, it can be used to form predictions for different GCSE and IGCSE subjects. Our ALICE assessments will provide predictions for A level and IB at post 16 as well. So they really give us an idea of what the student's potential is in terms of what their outcomes might be. And the assessments are standardised, and so the administration is the same for all students completing our baseline assessments, and all students will sit the assessment in the same way and have the same experience. Although all of the questions that they're presented with might not be exactly the same because of the adaptive nature of the assessment, they still have the same experience as all of the students completing the baseline assessment. And it's also inclusive for all because we do have an additional time version available as well for any students who might be usually allowed extra time in an exam. So just to summarise that, it's a single assessment that the students complete that includes adaptive sections. There are also some non-adaptive sections, which I'll go over in a second as well. And they're designed to provide a measure of the developed ability of a student. So we have adaptive sections that assess vocabulary and maths ability. In our mid-year assessment for 14 to 16-year-olds, not 14 to 16-year-olds. In our mid-year assessment, we have non-adaptive skills and non-adaptive non-verbal sections. And in the YELLIS assessment, we have non-adaptive patterns section, which includes questions on matching, reflections, and rotations. Our assessments have no sound, so there's no need for headphones. Students can sit at computers all in the same room and complete them at the same time. And in terms of timing, it takes around 55 minutes on average for the mid-year assessment and 45 minutes for the YELLIS assessment. So both assessments fit quite neatly into a single lesson period. We do have the 25% extra time version available for those students who would usually be entitled to extra time in exam conditions. So mid-year is for students in years 7, 8 and 9. So sorry, this is where I kind of fell over myself with my wording before. So for students who are age 11 to 14 in years 7, 8 and 9, they would complete the mid-year baseline assessment. And for students who are aged 14 to 16 years, so in year 10 and 11, they would complete the YELLIS assessment. Now, both of these assessments have vocab and maths sections because these are closely linked to being able to predict academic success and academic performance. Vocab is important for the prediction of most subjects. It's an important element of English, of course, but in other subjects as well, it's essential to have a range of vocabulary in order to do well. So I know, for example, when I taught GCSE business, students needed to read case studies about business scenarios, which would have a lot of information about businesses with some subject-specific vocabulary in there. They'd also need to understand the wording of the questions in order to be able to interpret them correctly so that could give the correct appropriate answer. So it is an important element of most subjects. And also, what it can show, if you have students with English as an additional language, it might be evident when you get the individual section scores back that they don't have a high vocab score, but they can demonstrate their ability level in the maths and non-verbal sections. So if you see a particularly low score for vocab ability, they might still have quite a high score overall because of those other sections, and they can demonstrate their ability, but you can see the evidence that they might need some additional support in terms of vocabulary. Both assessments have a maths section as well, because again, maths correlates well with most subjects. And although you might not need specific mathematical knowledge for different subjects, you do need an element of being able to work things out with speed and fluency. And sometimes you do need a little bit of maths in some GCSE subjects as well. So again, I can refer back to my experience in business. There were finance sections in our exams, and you might have to calculate revenue and profit or labour turnover and things like that. So maths can be required in other GCSE subjects as well, but just, even if it's not specifically, it is a good predictor of final achievement. In the mid-year assessment, there are sections for the modern world. So there's a scanning and skimming skills section. Again, this is really good for understanding how able students might be in exam situations, especially if they're presented with exams where they're required to read case studies, scenarios, extracts, texts, and things like that. Being able to actually scan and skim, in a timed situation under pressure and extract the right information that they can then use and apply the theory, that is a really important ability for exam success. And also there are questions related to 3D visualization, spatial aptitude and pattern recognition in the mid-year assessment as well. In the yellow section, the non-verbal section has questions on visualization, spatial aptitude and pattern recognition. So I'm very quickly going to give you just a look at some example questions that you might see in the different sections. So in the vocab section, students might be presented with a target image and have to find the word with the closest meaning, and they will be given multiple choice options to choose from. It might not be a picture, it might be a word to read, and they've got to choose the closest word or phrase that would match the meaning as well. Now these look quite simple, but the questions do get much more difficult than this as the students work through the assessment. In the maths section, they might be required to do some calculations and type their answer into the box. So for example, calculate a percentage, or they might be asked to interpret charts and graphs as well, and choose the correct multiple choice answer. Here are some examples from the skills section from the mid-year assessment. So they might be asked to do some proofreading and identify some mistakes in the text by highlighting them. And that might be spelling, punctuation or grammar. And also there's a perceptual speed and accuracy example question there as well, where you need to actually look at the letters and select the matching set from the 4 options. And because you're expected to do this in a certain amount of time, you've got that time pressure, and you've got to try and do those quite quickly and see how many that you can answer correctly. And just some more examples of non-verbal questions from the mid-year assessment. So we've got cross sections where you're presented with an image and you've got to decide what the cross section might look like if you cut it in half. We've got images where you've got to decide how many blocks it's made up of, in terms of small blocks or large blocks, even if you can't see all sides of the image. And also we've got some picture questions as well, where you've got to select from the right the image that would complete the picture sum. Got some example questions from Yellis. So we've got some matching questions where you would look at the image and decide which image matched. There are some reflection questions where you'll be presented with an image in front of a mirror and you've got to decide what the reflection might look like, and also explain what a rotation might look like if it was rotated, for example, 90 degrees. So once the students have gone through their assessments and they've answered the questions like the ones that we've just looked at in the examples, what do we actually get from those pre-16 mid-year and Yellis Chem assessments? Well, first of all, you'll get a set of standardised scores which can show how your students have scored compared to others who've taken the same test. And the standardised scores will highlight average scoring students, those who are above and those who are below average in terms of the national average of students who've taken this baseline assessment. You'll be provided with information on attainment, so visual attainment profiles, which highlight the significance of a student's Chem test results. So we present the data in table format, but also in the form of charts, visual charts, where you can clearly see how your students have performed in terms of the different sections, and you can see inconsistency at a glance in a test score really easily and identify where a student might have a lower ability in a certain area. Sometimes that's easier to see rather than looking at a lot of numbers on a chart. Some people prefer that visual attainment profile. And you'll also be provided with predictions, and those predictions again are provided in a table format, so you can see what the predictions are for GCSE subjects in a number of different subject areas. But in addition to that, you also get the chances graphs, which will show the probability of a student achieving the full range of final subject exam grades. So what percentage probability is there of this student with this particular baseline score achieving a level 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 9. And also value added. So if you submit your actual GCSE grades when the final subject exams have been taken, then within 48 hours you will be provided with a value added report, which will show the value added score in individual subjects as well across the school. So I can show you an example of what that looks like during this webinar. So you will have login details to our ChemSecure site, and when you log in, once your students have actually taken the assessment, then you will see a dashboard where you can select the reports that you want. So this is just an example of some of the reports that you'll be able to see. And these are a number of different reports that you'll be able to access, which show the baseline scores of your students. And I'll give you a close-up of some of these in just a moment. So there are reports on baseline scores. There are individual student reports, which are presented in the form of graphs and charts. We've got parent reports for parents and carers, which is the one that I mentioned before, which will actually give an explanation of what our baseline assessments are, what the different sections mean and why we assess those particular abilities, and it also gives an indication of what the results are and what those results mean. And in addition to that, we've also got some reports which give you information about your cohort, your present cohort, but also reports that compare this year's cohort to previous academic years as well, if you've completed baseline assessments in previous academic years. So just to give a little bit more information on that. Depending on what score the students get, they will be put into one of 4 bands. So if students score above 110, they'll fall into the top 25% in band A. If they score between 100 and 110, they'll fall into band B. Band C would include scores between 90 and 100, and band D would include any students with scores under 90. So when you get the reports, they'll tell you which band the student falls into for their overall score. And you'll also be provided with a cohort profile so you can see what percentage of a particular cohort fall into each of these particular bands. So on this particular cohort profile, you can see that 64% of the students in this year group fall into the category of band A. But you can actually filter that down as well when you're on the dashboard if you just want to see what students' ability levels are in terms of vocab, maths, non-verbal skills. You can select those in the filter and it will actually show you very specific information about your cohort. And also, this is the historical band profile that I mentioned. If you have been completing chem assessments for a number of years, you'll be able to compare this year's cohort's ability levels to the previous years as well. So, you know, this might help you in terms of allocating resources, for example, or for future planning, or deciding what type of intervention strategies or what might be a focus in your school in terms of school improvement, and just ensuring students have the right support in this particular academic year. And this is an example table. Each of these rows represents a different student in the cohort, and this tells you what the student's overall score is, what band they fall into, and what their scores are for vocabulary, maths, non-verbal, and skills. And just by glancing at that, you can see that some students might fall overall into band A, because they've got very strong scores in all of the sections. But sometimes overall they might fall into band A because they've had very strong sections, for example, in maths and non-verbal and skills, but actually they have a lower score in one of the other areas. So for example, there is a student on there, the first student that you can see that falls into band C for vocabulary with a score of 93. You know, at a glance, you might think, oh, this student falls into band A, they've got a very high overall score and they've got overall high level of ability. But actually, in order to achieve fulfill their potential at GCSE, they might just need that little bit of extra support in terms of their vocabulary. So it's really interesting to know what the students have scored in the individual areas as well. And yeah, as I mentioned, sometimes it's better to be able to see this as a visual representation. So we do have individual student reports as well, which will show the scores for a student in each section of the baseline assessment, with the national average standardised at 100, and you can see where their scores lie compared to the average line there as well. So if anything falls below the line, there might be the need for support there in that particular area. But if actually you see that it's quite a high score, then that might be an indication that you can challenge them more and you can provide some additional some additional activities, or just push them that little bit further in that particular area as well. So a lot of schools ask us, well, once we've got the data and we have this information, what next? It is really important to have data, but what's even more important is to use that data. And if you can use that in a way that's going to help improve performance in your school, it's going to be really valuable. So these are just some example interventions that some schools use if there are particularly low scores in particular areas. So in terms of vocabulary, if students have a significantly low score in terms of vocabulary, it might be useful, first of all, to consider, are there any particular reasons for that before you choose a relevant intervention strategy? So is this a student who has English as an additional language, and are they already receiving some support in that particular area? Is it a student who has some speech and language difficulties? And again, are they receiving some therapy or some specific sessions that are providing support in that area already? Or is it, is that something that they're not receiving support for that might be useful for them? Is it because they are more of a visual learner, for example, and they have quite a high overall ability, but that's because they learn in other ways and that they're able to access the curriculum despite those vocabulary issues that they have? But certainly there's a range of interventions which are used widely in schools anyway. It doesn't have to be an intervention where you are using additional resources or additional time outside of school. It could be interventions or just elements of teaching and learning that are happening within the classroom anyway. And it could be that if these things aren't happening, this could be something that you could encourage to enrich what's happening in the classroom and enrich your teaching and learning strategies that are taking place anyway. So for vocab, key term starters are always useful, whether that's something like a fast 5-minute retrieval activity at the start of a lesson, asking students to define some key terms that they learned in their previous lesson. And it might not be the lesson that they had yesterday or last week. It could have been earlier in the term or the term before, and just interleaving those retrieval activities to help make the vocabulary stick. It could be a fun activity like key term bingo, and giving them the definitions, reading the definitions aloud. Do they have the matching key term on their card? It could be a differentiated homework for somebody who has specific difficulties in terms of vocab, and asking them to produce some glossaries of key terms for homework as an alternative homework or an additional homework. It could be you actually providing word banks or developing them as time goes on for each topic and having those stuck in the book as a reference point. Ensuring that when you have discussion groups or collaborative learning within the classroom, that those have mixed abilities within them. So if you know what the vocab ability scores are for the students in your class, then having students grouped in accordance to that, not similar abilities but mixed abilities, where you can encourage modelling from those higher ability students in terms of vocab, alongside those who might struggle a little bit and need to develop their vocab. Encouraging wider reading, and that could be something in terms of providing reading lists and ideas, having book clubs and things like that outside of school, but it might be reading time within school and putting time aside for that. So whether that's a tutor time activity where students have time to read, but also including modelled reading from a teacher as well, so that they can actually read along at the same time, because that might be the support that someone with weaker vocab needs. And maybe ensuring that when you come across a word, if a student doesn't understand it, that they can highlight it, that they can ask you, you can talk about it, you can discuss that vocabulary. Or it might be a homework where they're required to read and summarise what they've read, for example. And also provide opportunities to enrich language and cultural experience, whether that be through listening to people talking about the subject and in different kind of experiences in different places. So whether that be going on an educational visit, whether it be watching a TV show, listening to a podcast where people are talking and using that vocabulary, reading articles and blogs online, attending exhibitions, that kind of thing. Something that might be a little bit more engaging, where students are immersed in that language and that vocabulary a little bit more. And also getting students to think about not just knowing a word and defining it, but really understanding that word and, helping them to think about, what is the word? Why did you use that word? Is there an alternative word that you could have used? So actually learning synonyms for it as well. If you'd used a different word, could that have altered the meaning in some way? And actually spending some time on the metacognition of the vocabulary as well. If you have students who have a lower maths score, again, it might require some dedicated time outside of lessons to develop that. But sometimes it can be included within your teaching and learning strategies as well. So I know this is an example from a school that I used to work in the maths department. They used to use green box examples. So as they were learning the different problem solving methods, for example, they would actually include a worked example at the start of the topic. They would all have that same worked example written in their book with a green box around it, and because it had a green box around it, they knew that they could refer back to that at any time. If they were struggling in terms of how to work something out, they had a worked example already there in their book to refer to, so they could support themselves. It could be just giving pupils extensive practice in new strategies and skills. So if students in the class have got it, they're ready to move on, they can work on their challenge tasks, whereas students who might struggle a little bit more in terms of their maths could have that time for repetition and practice and to go over and try it again and again. Providing chances for students to talk to each other and think aloud and talk through steps and decisions and why they did that, whether that be in paired work or whether it be during a Q&A section of the lesson. So directing your questions towards a student who might have a lower score in terms of maths. If it's maths related, then, and it doesn't have to be maths related, it just could be something where they have to work out a problem. If they're actually given the opportunity to talk through that, it does help to develop that skill. Feedback is really important as well, as it is in every subject. But providing students with extensive feedback where necessary, both written and verbal, in relation to developing maths ability can help to develop that skill as well. And just ensuring that teacher materials include a cumulative review in each session, that you, again, you've got that review and reflect period, you've got retrieval activities, you're going back to it again before you move on to ensure understanding. Making the best use of teaching assistants, of course, as well, and using teaching assistants to support students who might have lower maths score, where you think that's going to be particularly important during a particular lesson, and making it fun using maths games, for example. And of course, there's specialist software packages that can be used which provide differentiated tasks based on scores that they've achieved in the different maths lessons in different topics, for example. And it may require a student, if they've got a significantly low score in terms of maths ability, providing some maths tuition after school. If that's something that's funded in your school, that might be an option as well. And then in terms of low non-verbal scores, what kind of support can we offer here as well? I've mentioned poor behaviour there. Of course, not all students who have a low non-verbal score are going to present poor behaviour, absolutely not. But if a student is actually struggling somewhat in terms of their understanding, and this could relate to any ability level or struggling in any particular subject specific area as well. But if that does present in terms of poor behaviour, and because they lack an understanding of perhaps cause and effect as well, which can be linked to low non-verbal ability, just thinking of strategies to deal with that, understanding that it might be because of their low level of non-verbal ability, then, the use of restorative justice, for example, in terms of resolving behaviour issues, having restorative chats with teachers and other students, and using mediation as a tool for increasing empathy and helping, actually getting them to, instead of just giving a detention, for example, getting them to sit down with the people involved and talk through their actions and helping them understand what impact their actions had on other people around them as well, and helping them come to their own conclusions for that helps to build that understanding. But it could be something, it could present as them having difficulty in understanding diagrams, maps, having difficulties in terms of spatial awareness in subjects like PE, sport and drama. And it might just be necessary for those particular students to have more of a little bit of one-to-one support during sessions, during lessons, and showing them how to work through a problem, actually giving them some demonstration for them to see. That can help. And physical demonstrations, whether that be in terms of drawing, science experiments, or whatever it might be in the different subject areas, are going to be particularly useful with people with non-verbal scores. Give them the opportunity to give verbal explanations where possible before having to write something down or work something out. And making it fun as well, actually having the practice in the form of games and puzzles, and that could just be actually having break time and lunchtime clubs where they have the opportunity to take part in Sudoku activities, Lego shape building and things like that, just to develop that skill that little bit more. And this is an area where repetition and practice are particularly useful. So, it could be as simple as every day in tutorial, as they enter the classroom, having some sort of task that they can, or challenge that they can get on with straight away to really, get them to develop that non-verbal ability. Practicing skimming and scanning of exam case studies for answers that are subject specific, that can be really useful as well, especially doing under timed conditions, and just encouraging them to make information really clear in terms of highlighting text, making notes and bullet points on exam papers when they're doing practice assessments. Our data will show where students have low scores, but it'll also show where they're significantly high as well. And so, with these students, you can be really aspirational with targets, as you can with any student. All students should be given the opportunity to really, exceed expectations. But with gifted students in particular, you can really manage teacher expectations and show that they've got really high ability levels in the different areas, and really encourage challenge within the classroom, and make sure that these students are as clearly identified as students in other groups where you might be offering additional support, for example, pupil premium. And just, it might give you the opportunity to re-examine provision for gifted students across the school, and think about how much challenge is being offered to students, and that might require some staff development in terms of formative assessment and providing feedback and providing stretch and challenge activities, and also just encouraging directed questioning, which really focuses on pushing the boundaries of the students and getting them to give really high level analysis and evaluation within their answers. Asking for more open-ended homework activities just to encourage their creativity, offering opportunities for wider reading around the subject, and making sure they have the opportunity to access higher level exemplar work to see how that ability can be translated into a really positive exam paper. So in addition to that, we do also have reports which show predictions, as I mentioned, for GCSE and the chances graphs. So I'll show you a couple of examples of those very quickly. So this is what our report looks like, which shows the predictions for GCSE or IGCSE, depending on what you teach in your school. So this, again, each row will represent a student. It shows their standardized score and what band they fall into, and then what their predictions are across the subjects there. And this is what the chances graph looks like that I've mentioned a few times during this webinar. So it will show what percentage chance the students have of achieving each grade. And it's a really good conversation starter with students and parents. You know, whether that be that a student has a prediction of a 7, for example, because that's the most popular score of all the students who did the baseline assessment. But, you know, I think if they're not working hard, they're not revising, they're not putting full effort in class, you know, it's important to have the conversations that not all students, you know, you're not guaranteed level 7. A range of students of a similar ability level to you also got a level 6, but, you know, with hard work, you could be within that level 7 category, for example. But also having the conversation of potentially you could do better than that as well. There are some students who achieved a level 8, a level 9. So it's a really good one to have conversations with parents and students. And in terms of value added as well, we have a number of value added reports which are presented in different ways. But if we just have a look at the information that you're given, you know, as a school, obviously, you know, you might be measured, depending on the type of school, value added might be a very specific measurement of student performance, or, you know, you might be looking also at progress rate and attainment rate, for example. But value added feedback is really useful because you can see, have your students fulfilled their potential as indicated by their Chem baseline test performance? And then you can also look at in particular subject areas, have they achieved their potential? Grade distributions as well. Have any subjects added more value to their students? Have any subjects struggled? And that might help you to identify where best practice could be shared between departments, for example. And the value added feedback is reported at individual student level, so you can see what the value added score was for individual students in their different subjects at subject level and also school level. And you'll see charts like this one, where any students who have achieved significantly better exam results than expected will be in a dark green colour. So the colour-coded nature of it makes it really easy to read. A slightly lighter green will show where they've achieved slightly better exam results than expected. Any white ones, students have achieved the results they were expected. So value-added scores there on this chart, you can see between 0.1 and 0.3. If a student is below that line, a subject, you can see a subject where students have achieved slightly lower exam results than expected. There aren't any on here, but if it was dark red, then it would be a subject where students had achieved significantly worse exam results than expected as well. So that was a bit of a whistle stop to some of the reports there with some information on possible interventions as well. I'll hand over to Cora in a moment to pose any questions that might have been popped in the question box while I was talking, but there's some contact details on here as well. I'm the assessment advisor for the North. My email address is on there. And also we have Lucy Baker, who's the assessment advisor for the South. So if you want to speak to Lucy for any further information on our baseline assessments, whether you would be a new user or a current user and you just want some information and advice, we're here to answer any questions that you might have. So Cora, I'll hand over to you.
Oh, great. Thank you, Suzanne. That was really interesting. So I'll just have a look through. So if anyone has any questions or anything they'd like to ask Suzanne, either about what we discussed today or anything that we didn't cover, please do pop them in the question box now, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. I'll just have a look if we've got any. So we have a question about perhaps looking at the data and what's the best way to go about it? Is it better to look at a whole school level first, or look at the individual? Do you have any kind of advice on where's best to start, or perhaps the differences between them?
Yeah, I think it very much depends on how you want to use the data and what's the purpose. What information are you looking for, and what are you hoping to then achieve? So on an individual level, if you're looking at the individual student records, for example, and then you're sharing that data with teachers, then that's going to really support teaching and learning in the classroom, because teachers can then see on an individual level, student A has a low ability score in terms of vocabulary, and so therefore I know I need to support them that little bit more in terms of vocabulary in my lesson. So they might, in terms of their resources, that might be the student that they stick in their book a key term glossary. It might be the student that they make sure that they're going and giving that one-to-one support to. It might be the student that they give that slightly different homework to, which focuses on vocabulary. It might be the student that you ask to listen to this podcast where it really talks about the topic in detail. And so if you're looking at an individual level, I think that's really good for supporting teaching and learning. But if you're looking at it on a whole school level, so for example, if you're looking at your cohort profile, the cohort band profile, you'll be able to see from that, this year we've got a cohort with particularly low level ability in maths on average compared to the previous year. So this cohort are going to need a little bit more additional support in terms of maths. So you might look at your budget and you might decide to allocate some financial resources towards some additional maths tuition. And you know that you've got that so that you can use it with those students to support, exam success in that way. It may be that in terms of non-verbal ability, if you look at the cohort has got a particularly low level of non-verbal ability this year, then you might have a whole school focus on exam technique and really focusing on scanning and skimming skills for texts. And it might be just something that it just helps you to decide what your intervention strategies are going to be, how you're going to allocate resources, where your teaching assistants might be needed, in which classes. So I think it very much depends on what do you want to find out from the data, how are you going to use that data in terms of which reports you look at. But when you actually, if you buy the Chem baseline assessments, when you receive your login details, you also get a really detailed user handbook, a teacher handbook, and it tells you about each report. It tells you how the data can be used and how you might use that data. So you do get a lot of additional kind of written support to give you some ideas on how to use the different reports and what to look at. But in addition to that, we can support you with that as well on an individual basis. We do also have professional development where we can actually come in and do inset training days in terms of understanding the data. And another thing that we've set up recently are our Chem networks, where teachers get together to kind of share good practice in terms of how they look at the data, how they use the data, and what kind of strategies they have put in place based on the information that they found in the reports. So that, yeah, there's a lot that you can do with those reports and the data, depending on what your needs are.
Great, thank you, Suzanne. I think that is all of the questions we have. We have a specific question from one customer here, but Vedat will be in touch to answer your query there. But in terms of general questions, yeah, that is everything. So we must have covered it all. So thank you once again to Suzanne, our presenter, for the session today. It was really interesting to hear about those different reports and methods for improving school performance. So as Suzanne said, the contact details are on the screen for you there. So please do get in touch if there's anything we didn't cover today, or if you'd like to talk to us. We also have a few more webinars running for the rest of this term. We have one next week on wellbeing and the wellbeing check with Mark Fraser. So please do come along to that, and you can see on our website for all of our upcoming sessions. So thank you once again, everyone, for attending today, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.